Negotiations between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky could take place directly in the United States of America at the invitation of Donald Trump, and it will be very difficult for Vladimir Putin to refuse such a format. And it seems that Putin is now being driven like a rat into a new trap. Vladimir Zelensky is playing a diplomatic game in which Putin has almost no good winning moves left. Recently, the Ukrainian president took action that shifts the entire discussion about peace. He didn't just invite Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table once again. No, he started choosing the place and format of the talks in such a way that Putin's refusal would look as shameful as possible. And here, in these details, lies the essence of the current moment and the reason why people in Europe are now talking about the possibility of negotiations starting as early as this summer. My name is Oleg Alexei Pechiy. Let's discuss this together. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, leave any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link is in this video's description. Checklist. Identify main points, remove redundancy, keep proper names and events, preserve speaker's view, ensure grammatical accuracy, shorten text. Volodymyr Zelensky said he discussed a potential trilateral meeting between Russia, Ukraine, and the US, with Donald Trump on June 14 possibly in the US, like Alaska. His wording reveals something about the US itself. Well, I'll add from myself, for example, maybe in Alaska. The wording he used reveals the very idea. Such a meeting could have been organized in the United States of America in a format where it would have been much harder for Putin to refuse, at least to President Trump. That's a key nuance. Ukraine is shifting the burden of refusal. Now, if Putin says no, or as he said, I don't see any point in negotiations, he's not saying no to Zelensky, he's saying no personally to Donald Trump. That is, to the person whom the Kremlin practically worships as the only sane partner in the West. Moreover, in this situation, Putin is simply accumulating his own refusals to negotiate, which should finally prompt Donald Trump to start hitting back at Vladimir Putin's brazen face. At the same time, there is a second line, and that's the European one. And as it became known, Ukraine discussed this with the USSR, the USA, and France. The possibility of meeting with the Russians and personally with Putin on the sidelines of the G7 summit with the participation of all democratic countries these days. Zelensky explained the logic of choosing this particular platform quite directly. At the G7 summit today, Donald Trump, Macron, Starmer, Merz, and the leader of Canada are present. So Europeans plus America. And this is a very good opportunity for everyone to meet together with Vladimir Putin, to sit at a big table, and finally start negotiating about everything. Let me remind you, the summit is taking place from June 15 to 17 in the French town of Evian on the shore of Lake Geneva. And according to Zelensky, the United States agreed to invite Vladimir Putin to the meeting, which could already begin on Monday. According to sources, the invitation was sent through several channels at once. Through intermediaries, through diplomats, even through intelligence, and directly to the Russian side. And what about Putin? Well, Putin is feeding himself again. He messed himself, On the level of rhetoric, there was still an answer, and it is absolutely telling. Peskov said today that, well, we weren't directly invited there. He said there was no direct contact between Kiev and Moscow regarding such a meeting at the G7 summit. But he didn't mention that such an invitation was again made through intermediaries, diplomats, and even intelligence channels. Well, then Peskov repeated the old mantra. He said if Zelensky is ready to talk about it responsibly and seriously, he can always come to Moscow, where he will be received. So basically, the only platform that Putin agrees to recognize is the capital of the aggressor state, which by definition is impossible for the head of a warring country to visit. As you know, this isn't an invitation to talk. This is a way to avoid dialogue while saving face and showing the Russian rabble that their leader is still tough, like, look at him. I'm inviting Zelensky to Moscow, but he's not coming. But in reality, reasonable people understand that this is cowardice. That is, Putin perfectly understands that no one is going to go to that stinky Moscow and will never come. And that's why he says, come to Moscow. Come to Moscow, come on, are you scared? The point is that all wars have always ended with negotiations on neutral territory. They're already telling Putin directly, let's meet on neutral territory. Name the place and time, come on. No one is going to your stinky Moscow, that's it, forget about it. But Putin is scared. He's just wetting himself like a little boy. Now the most important thing, why doesn't Putin actually go to negotiations? Here, the public version from the Kremlin and the assessments of Western analysts differ radically. Moscow's version is built around Alaska. Lavrov, just yesterday, June 15, stated that Russia is counting on the fulfillment of the agreements reached by Putin and Trump on August 15 of last year in Anchorage, and that the key components of this agreement were proposed by the US itself and Putin simply accepted them. And supposedly, if this doesn't happen, then Putin doesn't want to meet or talk to anyone. The problem is that there is no published text of these agreements in Alaska. What exactly was agreed upon, the Russian side does not say publicly. And the most common interpretation, I emphasize interpretation, is that Trump supposedly agreed to give Russia the entire Donbass, although Trump publicly denied the existence of such an agreement. And here the mechanics of the Kremlin's game are as follows. Moscow exploits the very absence of an official document to retroactively attribute content favorable to itself to that meeting in Alaska, and to portray Russia as ready for peace, as a side that is supposedly being cunningly deceived. It's the same way that unwashed Russia used some alleged verbal promise of NATO not expanding eastward as a pretext for attacking Ukraine. When Russians claim NATO promised not to expand eastward, the question is always, where's the document? Russians then say it was a verbal promise. We were given a verbal promise, but it wasn't kept. Whether such a promise was made, no one knows. The same thing is happening now regarding Alaska. Whether there was an agreement between Putin and Trump about Donbass, no one knows. There are no documents. Now, Russians claim they were verbally promised things would be this way, so they're waiting for those agreements to be fulfilled, even though they may never have existed. Western think tanks see this in a completely different way. For example, the Institute for the Study of War puts it this way. Ukraine continues to demonstrate readiness for a meeting of leaders, while the Kremlin shows a continued pursuit of maximalist military goals and a complete unwillingness to negotiate. In response to Zelensky's open letter on June 4th proposing a ceasefire and a personal meeting, Putin replied that he had glanced at the letter but saw no point in meeting. At the same time, as noted by the Institute for the Study of War, neither the US nor Russia has published any statements or communiques about the alleged agreement reached in Alaska. And the Kremlin repeatedly exploits this lack of official documents. The root of the problem lies in Vladimir Putin's distorted worldview, and this is perhaps the most troubling observation in this entire story. Putin still believes that a military victory for Russia is inevitable, despite data showing otherwise. The Institute for the Study of War directly states the diagnosis. Putin's statements about the situation on the battlefield are incompatible with the available facts, which indicates that the Russian military command is not providing Putin with reliable intelligence about the real state of affairs. In other words, the person on whom the end of the war depends is making decisions based on embellished reports from his own generals. That is why, according to analysts, Putin's unwillingness to cut military spending and end the war suggests that he believes he can win in the near or medium term. But it was the same at the beginning of 2025, but Putin still hasn't won. But the reality for the Kremlin is getting worse, and even Zelensky himself is saying this now, and essentially the numbers confirm it. Today, Zelensky clearly stated that Ukraine already holds those very cards. Russian troops tried to advance in 12 directions during the spring-summer offensive, but almost everywhere they lost the initiative. Slow progress by the Russians is observed only in 2 or 3 areas where Russia has concentrated a huge amount of manpower and equipment. And here a beautiful symbolic phrase emerges, I would say, in 2025. In the White House, Trump threw that very phrase at Zelensky, saying that Ukraine has no cards in this war. Now Zelensky is basically responding that the cards have appeared. According to him, Ukraine looks better than Russia when it comes to carrying out medium and long-range strikes. This year, the production of about 10 million drones is planned, and the capacity allows this number to be doubled to 20 million, but that requires money. He also called the decision of the partners to allocate 90 billion euros in European support a pillar of stability. And this military background is the real answer to the question, why does Vladimir Putin avoid the negotiating table? The logic is very simple. Any negotiations always fix the status quo, and the status quo for Russia is getting worse every month. What does this mean? Burning oil refineries, burning terminals, oil processing in Russia at a 16-year low. Military spending is already taking up half of the Russian budget. To sit down at the table now. This means admitting that the blitzkrieg has turned into a war of attrition, which Russia is losing economically. That's why the Kremlin chooses a delaying tactic under the cover of some agreements that no one has seen. And whether negotiations will take place in the near future, well, in the short term, almost certainly not. Definitely not at the G7 summit, and most likely not in the United States in the near future either. European leaders are now trying to persuade Trump to increase pressure on Russia and support, for example, joint production of drones for Ukraine. This is the true meaning behind everything that's happened recently. Ukraine is shifting its diplomacy into a mode where every refusal from Moscow is publicly documented in full view of Donald Trump and all of Europe. In other words, Zelensky is no longer trying to persuade. He's setting up traps of politeness. There's such a thing in diplomacy, a trap of politeness, from which any way out for Putin looks like an escape. And that's why we can state that negotiations won't start anytime soon. Not because there's no one to offer them to, or because there's no platform and so on. No, they simply won't start. Simply because the man in the Kremlin is very afraid to admit that he's an old, frail grandfather who has already lost. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel. I would be grateful for that. You can do this with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.